Good evening to everyone here in England and Erev Tov to everyone in Israel. First, I'd like to thank Adi, the wonderful tzedakah, and I'd like to thank all of those who helped me with this evening's presentation, Sally Ann, Liron, Dov, and Craig, who put on also as an introduction, the beautiful music of the Polish composer Chopin and his famous Nocturne C in sharp minor, which was the beautiful music and so heart-stirring that was the beginning music of the Polish radio immediately after the Second World War and was the last piece they played before the Second World War. It was also the instrumental music for the film The Pianist. Poland is contentious. Germany, we know where we stand, we know how we feel, and the majority of Jews in the world feel negatively about Poland. It is invariably said that anti-Semitism is imbibed with the Poles' mother's milk. And yet there are those, of course, who will say that Poland was not all bad. It was no worse, no better, but no worse than many, many other countries during the period of the Second World War. They had many, and the most of the righteous Gentiles come from Poland, and many Poles also worked tirelessly to save Jewish lives. On the eve of World War II, there were about 3 million Jews in Poland. They were 10% of the whole of the Polish population. Today, there are hardly any. There was no European country where so many Jews had been living for so long. Jews first came to Poland probably towards the end of the 10th century, around 966, but they weren't a conquered people. They weren't a people dragged in. They were invited by Poland in order to help, along with Germans as well, to develop a poor and backward country economically and otherwise. But the church was a nova plantatio, a new planting. They were virulent and they didn't want their people to be diverted by the presence of Jews and their ideas. And therefore, whilst the church in many different countries approached the Jews in many different ways, the church in Poland was virulent from the start and had a very negative attitude towards its Jews. But not all in Poland was lachrymose. During the period of King Casimir III, Casimir the Great, he is said to have actually married or had a Jewish wife, and he gave his name to Kazimierz, that area then outside Cracow and today essentially part of Cracow, which we know for those of us who have traveled there so well. By 1580 to 1648, we entered into a golden age of Polish Jewry. Not all sadness, not all awfulness there in Poland. And the people who would arise in this period, the rabbis that would arise in this period, would give to Polish Jewry, to the world of Ashkenaz, and to the world of Jewry to this very day, some of the greatest of contributions. First, there was Solomon Luria, the Marshal, who would, through his great Talmudic expertise, advance the welfare and the knowledge of Talmud. He would also often be at loggerheads with the Ramah, Rabbi Moses Isserles of Cracow. Rabbi Moses Isserles was, without question, one of the greats, one of the premier rabbis of all time, for it was the Ramah, Moses Isserles, who would take the world of codification of Jewish law, essentially absorbed from a Sephardi point of view, and add to what was called the Shulchan Aruch of Cairo, more with a Sephardi bent. He would take this and he would add to what was in English the prepared table, his mapa, his tablecloth, and would give it a gloss and identify and bring about those differences between the Sephardi world and the Ashkenaz world. He was famed, he was revered. He was revered in the Jewish world and revered in the non-Jewish world. And on his Yortzeit on Lag BaOmer, Jews and non-Jews would come to his synagogue and come to the cemetery which is there today to visit the grave of Moses Isserles and many of his family next to whom he is buried. Even at this period, there were those who felt that girls and women were out of touch with the way of the Jewish world and with the men who were able and capable of understanding, reading, comprehending the Hebrew language and understanding Torah and all the other works which go alongside it. But women were somehow separated, not necessarily educated. Their purpose in those days was very different. And Rabbi Jacob Ashkenazi, he would write a work known as the Sena Urena, Go and See. And he would write this work in Yiddish at the end of the 16th century, around 1590. He would write this work in order that initially men without knowledge and women definitely without knowledge would be able to understand a work which expounded on and delved into the niceties and the beauty of Chumash, Haftarot, and also the 5 Megillot. But Sena Urena did not only contain beautiful pieces with odd bits of midrash to explain what it was talking about, it would even give beautiful little instructions to who eventually would be just for the women, when the women read this at home or in their synagogues, they would be instructed at certain points. It would say at the columns next to the major work, it would say, now cry, so that it would emotionally involve them in the beauty of the text that they were reading. And the Sena Urena is around to this very day. But like all golden ages, whether it was Spain or whether it was Poland, golden ages, even if a little bit tarnished, come to an end. And in 1648, the hordes advanced Khmelnytsky from the Ukraine, and he would advance against his Polish overlords, and at the same time, he would attack the Jews. There had been nothing like it, it was said, since the destruction of the Second Temple, and nothing like it until events of the mid-20th century. And Khmelnytsky, who is revered in Kiev, his statue still stands there in many places, murdered anywhere between, and numbers are always difficult to ascertain, anywhere between 50 and 100 to 200,000 Jews. Today, we see a world that began to change in the 18th century. For in Poland, we got the advancement of Hasidism, which tore into the traditional Orthodox world, enveloping it in a new ideal, a new way of thinking, a new approach to religion for those who couldn't follow in depth. And at the same time, there was a pull on Judaism as of the 18th century. The Enlightenment took Jews away from traditional Judaism towards a bigger, wider, more interesting for them world. By then, as we approach the end of the 19th century, approximately 80% of Polish Jewry lived in Stott and Städtlach. These were little towns, little villages, and shtetls. Today, the subject of 1918, thereabout, to 1939, is a story of Polish Jewry between the war to end all wars and the war for them which did end all wars. At the end of the First World War, the governments of the world, the victorious governments of the world, enacted upon Poland a minorities treatment. And Poland was the first to sign it. And it was in order that countries should have entry to the League of Nations and to the new United Nations. It was, it said, to protect all ethnic groups and minorities and smaller ones of religion, whatever was different about them, they have to be protected. This was the new way of the world. And Poland, therefore, was brought forward into this world that they had to take care of, look after, and show consideration to their Jewish minority. They were not their only minority, but we're dealing with a Jewish minority. And two particular areas. One, they were to give and make sure that the Jews had facilities for education, that there was always money to help with education. And secondly, that Jews should not be compelled to work on the Sabbath day. Well, there's an interesting thing in The Spectator this week about Poland and the vaccine. And Poland doesn't like being told what to do today. And in 1919, it didn't like to be told what to do then. And far from helping the Jews, the minority treaty to the Poles was an interference in their new national state which had been created out of the embers of the First World War. Nationalism stated that they are Poland and fighting for Poland, and the Jews, far from being better off, the Poles would not listen to those who told them what to do. The Jews were inferior, the Jews were lesser, and to be Polish, you needed to be Catholic. And anti-Semitism in Poland was not a lunatic fringe by a man who came from Austria with a little-known party, but it was the mainstay of the main political parties running Poland at that time. And anti-Semitism was pervasive, and Poland was for the Poles. In 1926, there appeared to be a period, a short gap in this never-ending torrent of anti-Semitism in Poland when Marshal Piłsudski came to leadership. He overtook the government. And Piłsudski was revered by the Jews, as you'll see and hear in the films which we'll see. But Piłsudski was revered by the Jews, and who wept when he died was not all good. All good is not in our way of thinking, for he invited Goebbels to Poland, and he joined with him with a German-Polish pact. He continued the economic strangulation of the Jews of Poland, and he rebelled against the Minorities Treaty. Discrimination against the Jews persisted. They were no longer able to find Jews with non-Jewish companies. They had to work 6 days a week, and if you came from the religious part, that was earth-shattering. The names had to be on the stores. In that way, Poles would be able to identify a store as Jewish. It was no good putting the word chemist or ironmonger or horse whatever provider. You had to put your name on it. In that way, the Poles would identify the store as Jewish, and they could boycott it. And pogroms continued. In Bialystok in 1936, the Bialystok region, there were 21 pogroms and 348 attacks on Jews. We are now coming to see a film of Warsaw, 1939. Yitzhak and Shaul Goskind were two filmmakers, well known, quite renowned in Poland at the time for the making of their films. And they were approached, in fact, by Jabotinsky, who had an innate ability to understand the present situation wherever he was, and he traveled vigorously around the world. And in Poland, he felt the pain of Poland, and he felt the pain and the need of Palestine. And he approached the Goskin brothers, one of whom died in Israel at the age of 96, in that they should make films in 6 different locations in Poland. That was in Vilnius, which was then part of Poland, Bialystok, Lwów, Lodz, Cracow, and Warsaw. And after he made these films of a very normal way, he didn't go out of his way to be overexcitable. He didn't go out of his way to film people in the dregs of poverty. He didn't go out of his way to show the worst. He went out of his way to show Polish Jews living as normal people live. And at the end of his filming, these 6 films were sent by ship to New York. It would seem that the problem was that on the parcel containing these films, very advanced for their time, he failed to put the name to whom it was sent, and therefore they remained collecting dust in a post office in New York until in 1943 somebody found them, and only eventually did it become clear that what they had in front of them was unique. These are the last images of Polish Jewry ever taken. Some of them are filmed literally weeks before the outbreak of the Second World War. Please, do not judge these films on the quality of your television today, on the films you might see. Judge them on the quality of films that are now over 80 years of age. And although you may not get the greatest clarity in every scene within the film of Warsaw, listen to the commentary, absorb the culture, and see the joy that existed amongst Warsaw Jews. Now,
Warsaw, the capital of Poland. A modern metropolis on the banks of the Vistula River. 1.25 million inhabitants, 1/3 of them Jews. The largest Jewish community in Europe. The city hums with activity. Over its broad streets and attractive buildings towers the city's first skyscraper, the second tallest residential building in Europe. The old royal palace now serves as the residence of the President of the Republic. Near the palace rises a tall stone column, on top of which stands the statue of the Polish king, Zygmunt Waza III, who in 1596 transferred the capital of Poland from Cracow to Warsaw. Not far from the palace is the old city of Warsaw. Its first houses were built between the 12th and 14th centuries. In its center is a large square surrounded by tall, narrow, walled houses pressed close up against each other. No house has more than 3 or 4 windows in its facade. Each has its own charm of style, with arches and ornamentations decorating its front. The most attractive house in the ancient square is the Fouquier House, which for more than 400 years has been famed for its cellar of ancient and exquisite wines. The first mention of Jews living in Warsaw occurs in 1414. In the old city, there was then a special street named the Street of the Jews. In 1483 came the first expulsion of Jews from Warsaw, and then the Street of the Jews ceased to exist. Several years later, a few Jews were allowed to return to Warsaw. Time and again, decrees of expulsion and limitation of rights were promulgated against them, and many times their Polish neighbors and the conquering Russian hordes struck at them with pogroms and blood riots. Only at the end of the 18th century did the Jews obtain legal rights to settle in the city. Then a large Jewish concentration developed, especially in and around Nalewki Street in the north of Warsaw. This area later became the most important commercial and industrial center of all Poland. In 1917, there were already some 350,000 Jews living in Warsaw, more than 40% of the population of the entire city. Here there was once a Jewish neighborhood. Today, it is the Theater Square where the Warsaw City Hall stands. Opposite the City Hall is the Polish Opera and also some of the country's most important theaters. This is the Jewish Community Building. It contains offices and the Bresson Museum, the first Jewish museum in Poland. In this building is situated the Autonomous Council of Warsaw's Jews. To the left stands a trade school with 300 Jewish students. The Jewish community maintains some 30 educational institutions, apart from hospitals and clinics, synagogues, and social welfare institutions. There is also a large number of private Hebrew high schools and also many elementary schools, Talmud Torahs, Tarbut, Yavne, Tzisha, and also a seminary for rabbis, Tachkimoni, a seminary for Jewish teachers, an institute for Jewish studies, and many yeshivas. The Jewish streets hum with activity and commerce, especially in the Nalewki, Ganche, Franciszkanska area, the center of the garment and footwear industries of all Poland. Already in the 19th century, Warsaw Jews of distinguished families laid the foundations for Poland's industry and finances. They built mines, railways, founded banks, and developed Poland's international trade. It was they who turned Poland from a backward country into an industrialized state. Thanks to them, Warsaw became a most important economical, cultural, and spiritual bridge between Eastern and Western Europe. The roofed market, Kalimirowska, where the trade is in food products, fish, meat, fruit, vegetables. Here, as in the nearby Wielopole market, almost all the vendors are Jews. On Saturdays and Jewish holidays, trade stops there, almost completely. And the peddlers selling haberdashery, cigarettes, fruit, bagels, and other wares are almost all Jews. They trade here without a permit, which is why they are persecuted by policemen who constantly pick on them, and not infrequently destroy their wares and imprison them. Most of Warsaw's merchants and artisans are Jews. Bagels are an important source of income for Warsaw's peddlers. A tinker passes through the courtyards of the houses calling, "I sharpen, I repair." This too belongs to Jewish life in the streets of Warsaw, as in Dzika Street, where some 30,000 Jews live. In one of the courtyards of this street, the Jewish oculist Dr. Ludwig Zamenhof, the creator of Esperanto, lived for many years. Today the street is named after him. Dr. Zamenhof's grave is in the Jewish cemetery, which was founded as early as the beginning of the 19th century. In this cemetery, there stands the Peretz tent over the graves of Yud Lamed Peretz, Yaakov Dinizon, and Shin Ansky, who are among the greatest of Jewish writers. Here, too, is the grave of Esther Rachel Kaminska, the mother of the Jewish theater. Warsaw is the world center of Jewish theater. Today, there is a guest performance by the Habima Theater Company from Palestine. Klomatska Street, home of the Jewish Writers Club, which is famous throughout the Jewish world. This is the great synagogue, Nozik. Tens of thousands of Warsaw's Jews gather in 300 synagogues and in the prayer houses of almost 100 Hasidic rabbis. The Krashinsky Garden in Nalewki Street is on Saturday the kingdom of Jewish mothers and children. When the children grow up, many of them will probably join one of the Jewish political parties or youth movements, Zionist, socialist, religious, from Hashomer Hatzair and Echalutz to Agudat Yisrael, the Bund, and the underground Communist Party whose center is in Warsaw. They will dream of building a new world, some in the land of Israel, some in Poland itself, and some, who knows? Of the 230 Jewish periodicals in Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish appearing in Poland, 27 of them are dailies. The vast majority is published in Warsaw. Most of these, and especially the Heint and the Moment, are also read in many other Jewish communities. Saturday, Shabbat. Jewish Warsaw rests from work and commerce. Warsaw, 1939.
If anybody has any questions, they can be sent through to us and or questions to Charles, and you'll see that in front of you. We'll then look at the questions, and if we have time, we'll take one or two of them. Of the 6 films which were sent to New York, the one of Lodz has never been found, which is a shame really, because my family comes from Lodz. But that is how it is. It has never been found to this day, and people still hope that one day it will surface. There is a tendency in more than 1 or 2 of these films to mention America. Now, they just thought that Jabotinsky wanted America to be mentioned because he wanted the films to appeal to Americans in order to gain American support for Zionist endeavors to get the Jews of Poland to Palestine. And that is why he will mention this more than once. This film is the original footage. However, it is a second version. The original was in Yiddish to rather clanky music in a Yiddish commentary with subtitles which are rather disturbing for the image, which aren't that great in the first place. And therefore, what we're seeing is a later placed English commentary which sticks more or less to the original Yiddish and was done in the 1980s, as was the very powerful, I feel, musical background to the whole of this film. Warsaw was, like Cracow, a university town. And if the Jews already were unable to find work, unable to work often because they were compelled to work on the Sabbath, which many would not, because they were on the receiving end of pogroms and other anti-Semitic attacks, on the receiving end of boycotts, it would be that the universities, as is the age-old reality, were the centers of anti-Semitic sentiment. And the universities would have numerous clauses as to how many Jews could go to university. And then they would introduce, especially in Warsaw, Jewless days, days of which Jews were not allowed to go to university. Jewless weeks, they were not allowed to attend university. And then Jewless or Jew seats where only Jews could sit. They were not allowed to sit on non-Jewish seats. Jews would often rebel against this and stand at the side of the corridors, refusing to sit in the seats which were allocated for them. The situation did not improve. Jews go to Palestine became the watchword of the time. But as the 1930s approach, where were the Jews to go? Will they go to the scheme set up in Madagascar, or actually never really set up? Will they go to America, where America was shutting the doors? Could they go to Palestine, where the British had shut the doors? Where were the Jews to go? The Dominican Republic, the only country that from Evian Conference would allow them in. To the Jews, Poland had returned to the Middle Ages. But what type of Jews lived in Poland? There is a tendency, and I've heard it from many people, who tend to think that Poland was a country, somehow was like Fiddler on the Roof, but 3 million people like Fiddler on the Roof, where everybody went around singing about how joyously they'd been married for 25 years, and they had gorgeous daughters, and they were dancing around and having wonderful weddings with candles. The reality, and everybody seemed to be ultra-religious, or what they would call orthodox traditional. The reality was very, very different. The Jews of Poland by this period before the Second World War lived in poverty, and poverty in Poland was real poverty, not like the poverty we know of today. And the major group who no longer wanted to be Jewish were the assimilationists, as what they were known. And this group represented merely 10% of the Jewish world. So there weren't many of them, and they weren't that powerful. But they were Jews who didn't want to really be Jewish, who wanted to be rid of the cloak of Talmudic darkness, the cloak of shtetl clothing, the cloak of Yiddish and such a vernacular. They wanted to be accepted by the Poles as being like them, to dress like them, to speak like them. And when asked what they were not Polish Jews, they were Poles of the Mosaic faith, or they were Poles of Jewish inheritance. And that is as far as they would go. But they worked hard at being accepted by the Poles, and the irony was that as hard as they tried for themselves and their children, they still were not accepted by the Poles. And so they found themselves in a world which was disconcerting. At least 2,000 to 3,000 a year, probably from this group, converted to Christianity. Did they believe? Was it pragmatic? Who knows? The adults, on one level, were very, very well off, in that they weren't picked on necessarily for being Jews, because they didn't look like Jews. They looked like you and me. We dressed like the people that we live among. And these Jews, these assimilationists, who were out of the pale as far as Jews were concerned, they dressed. They wore hats like the Poles, and suits like the Poles, and ties like the Poles, and shoes like the Poles. But to the Poles, they were Jews. And so they found themselves in a never, never land, unacceptable to the Poles, and psychologically bereft, because they had no grounding, because Jews did not accept them either. Then there were the secularists. This was most of 2 million Polish Jews at the time. They believed that the world that existed for the past hundreds of years, the type of clothing, the type of learning, the type of places they lived in, was a world which has had its day, and we had to move on and out, and we needed secular education. And they found themselves absorbing what there was of Polish literature and Polish classics and others which came from other countries, of Germany and France and other places. And as secularists, especially among the young, they fled from the dark, dank, Talmudic world, and whilst the elder ones held on. Interestingly, as compared with Germany, there was no or very little reform in Poland. It was not an organization that ever really got off the ground. These people remained secular, but as it were, their membership was with traditional Orthodox. And then we come to the group that normally we think of, the most visible group, the most high-profile group, the 1 million, 1/3 of Polish Jewry that existed, the traditional Orthodox, or they call themselves the Yiddische Yidden. They were the people who adhered to traditional Judaism as it was laid down for them by all the codifications and the Talmudic directives that came to them. And they found themselves, because of their higher visibility, often on the receiving end of greater, much greater anti-Semitism. But amongst the Orthodox, it became aware, just as Jacob Ashkenazi had recognized that women and girls could not understand Hebrew, there was a recognition that there were problems in the world of women in the traditional Orthodox world. That there were girls, because Poland by now enacted that all children had to go to school. So it was impossible for even in this world to prevent your daughters going from school, and there were no Jewish schools as such. So they went to secular schools, or they went to Catholic schools. And when young girls, impressionable, inquiring, inquisitive, desiring to know more of an outside world, went to these schools, they absorbed the very culture which was anathema to their parents. And then around 1903, there came an awareness of this who said we have to have schools. We have to have schools which bring in Jewish girls who will learn not only Kodesh studies, but will also learn secular studies. And eventually, by the First World War, a woman arose, a seamstress out of nowhere, as it were, and her name was Sarah Schneerer. And she said, and she applied herself, that all girls have to be brought back before we lose them. And she would establish the Beis Yaakov institution. And she would be supported initially by the Belzer Rebbe, who said it was a good idea, although he would not send his own children, or he would not support it in getting others to send their children into the schools. And she had this vision, a vision whereby children, girls, would be taught not only religious studies, but secular as well. They would learn science as if it was religious, for science would prove that God's creation was something magnificent, and they would learn literature to show that God had inspired people to write literature and poetry and music. And more so, interestingly, she got all her students to learn German. Why German? Why German and not Polish? Although they learned Polish. Because Schneerer herself, during the First World War, was in Vienna. And there she became inspired by a man who would not naturally sit in the world of Ger and bells and the Chofetz Chaim, not naturally. And this was Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. And Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the great leader of 19th century neo-orthodoxy out of Frankfurt, would inspire her, would teach her there was a way of having Judaism with Jewish studies and secular world as well. And she would introduce into her school, therefore, German, so that all the girls could learn the translation of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and could translate his translation, as it will understand, his translation of the Bible. Schneerer, we commemorate this week her Yahrzeit, for she died in 1935, having established by the time of her death in Poland itself 250 Beis Yaakov schools with thousands of girls reclaimed, as it were, back into an Orthodox world. And in Cracow, there would be a SEM. This movement would be taken over by Aguda, who was a major representative of Polish Jewry in the SEM, the Polish Parliament. And they themselves, although virulently anti-Zionist, would by the end of the 30s come over towards Zionism. The Cracow film we will now see.
Cracow, a city 1,000 years old in the south of Poland. In Jewish tradition, it is called Cracow. From 1138, Cracow was the capital of the kings of Poland. They established their residence in the glorious Wawel Palace, which dominates the entire city. At the entrance to the palace stands the statue of the Polish freedom fighter, Tadeusz Kosciuszko. The famous Cathedral of Wawel. Here are interred Poland's kings, her national heroes, and poets. Old Cracow was surrounded by a wall in which were 50 towers, gates, and fortifications, some preserved to this day. Behind its walls and towers, the city's trade and commerce is carried on. Along the streets leading to the market square are many magnificent shops owned by Poles and Jews. The shops also surround the ancient square, which is full of historical landmarks. In its center stands the municipality building, built in the 14th century. Cracow is called the city of the 100 churches, and the most beautiful of these is the Church of St. Mary, built in the Gothic style. Its towers all of different heights. Every hour, a trumpet blast is sounded from the top tower. This trumpet blast is also broadcast daily at noon throughout Poland. The statue of Adam Mickiewicz, Poland's national poet and great friend of the Jews, stands opposite the Sukiennice building, which divides the market square. The building contains dozens of shops, and on its top floor, we find the Cracow National Museum. In the 14th and 15th centuries, this square was called the Jewish Square. The Jews who fled to Poland from the riots and expulsions in Western Europe settled in Cracow at the beginning of the 12th century. They enjoyed the support of Poland's kings, and they built community institutions and developed a variegated commerce. But the community's prosperity was disturbed from time to time. The Christian merchants organized pogroms with the support of the clergy and forced the king to expel the Jews from Cracow. In 1495, the Jews were expelled from their homes and went to live in the village of Kazimierz, not far from Cracow. Until the middle of the 19th century, the Jews of Cracow continued to live in cramped quarters in Kazimierz, which became the Jewish ghetto of Cracow. In the 19th century, the village became a part of Cracow, and from 1867, Jews were again permitted to live in any part of Greater Cracow. Nevertheless, a considerable portion of the Jewish population, which numbers 60,000 souls, lives to this day in Kazimierz, which the Jews call Kuzmir. This is a poor district, but many of the richer Jews prefer to live here and be close to the communal institutions and the old synagogues. Rebbe Isaac Shul was built at the beginning of the 17th century by Rabbi Yitzchak Yekelish, head of the Jewish community. Not far from there stands the Temple, a new synagogue, where the Zionist leader, Dr. Yehoshua Ton, delivers the sermons. A synagogue built in the 16th century bears the name of the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, one of the great codifiers in the history of Judaism. Here he composed the Mappah, or the tablecloth, to complement the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo from Safed, and to adapt it to the customs of Ashkenazi Jewry. The old cemetery next to the synagogue named after the Ramah. Here are buried great rabbis of the period. Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Heller, the great Talmudist Rabbi Yaakov Pola, the Kabbalist Rabbi Natan Neta Shapira, and many others. On Lag BaOmer, the anniversary of the Ramah's death, thousands of Jews come from all over Poland to prostrate themselves upon his grave. There are many synagogues in Cracow, and they recall days of glory as well as days of massacre and heroism. The Kupa Shul, the Popper, and the tall synagogue, where the prayer hall has been built on the top floor for security reasons. The Alte Shul, a synagogue built in the 14th century in the shape of a fortress, the oldest synagogue in Poland. In the old framework of Kazimierz, modern life proceeds now with all the social, cultural, and charitable institutions. Beside the community building is the modern Jewish hospital. It has 115 beds. The best Jewish doctors serve in its 6 wards, and they receive Jewish patients from the entire area, nor do only Jews come here for help. The Hebrew High School. Here, and in the elementary school beside it, some 1,500 pupils study. This is one of the many educational institutions maintained by the Jews of Cracow. The Hebrew language is also taught in other schools, the Mizrahi, the Tachkimoni, the Beit Yaakov, in the Ort and the Ognisko trade schools, in the commercial high schools, and of course in the cheters and yeshivas of Kazimierz. The Jewish Academics House. 140 students in various institutes of higher learning live here, and it constitutes an important cultural and social center. The Jewish Orphanage, one of the model charitable institutes of Jewish Cracow. Various Jewish organizations take care the children of the poor should grow up healthy and study and enjoy the summer camps and medical care like all other Jewish children. Old Cracow today is surrounded by avenues of chestnut trees. These avenues were planted in place of the wall which surrounded the city in the past, and they border upon the Jewish district. They have become a regular meeting place for the inhabitants of Cracow, who come here in their youth and in their old age to enjoy the shade and the scent of the chestnut trees, to walk, to talk about the cloudy political situation, or about the chances of the local Maccabi group winning the Polish water polo championship. Meanwhile, from the nearby houses come the sounds of song, of the pioneering and Zionist youth movements, and echoes of arguments between Zionists and members of the Bund, or between the Mizrahi and the Socialist Zionists. The people walking here have already read the Jewish newspaper in Polish calling for migration to the land of Israel. Some will be going this evening to the Jewish theater to see a performance of Bar Kochba by Goldfaden. Nor among all these will there be lacking a type like Menachem Mendel from Cracow, who runs around, sweating and bustling, seeking livelihoods from the air. But when Sabbath comes, rest comes to the Jewish district of Kazimierz. Business stops, and the shops close. The Jews hurry to the prayer houses in silken kapotas, their heads crowned with streimelach. This is how they go to Sabbath prayers. Git Shabbos, Git Shabbos.
The awfulness of these films that we've seen is the reality that nearly every single person we have seen in these beautifully made films would not be alive. But of course, at that point, they could not have dreamt, they could not have known, no one could have dreamt of what the future held. It's interesting, I have shown the one of Cracow before, and after showing it in one particular place, a man came over to me, an elderly gentleman, and he said, in that film, there was a small boy sitting on a step. That small boy was me. And so he was the one, maybe one of the very few survivors. We come now to the beginning of the end, or in reality, it was the end of the end. The last years of Polish Jewry. And the Jews were divided, Zionists and Socialists, Bundists and Yiddish speakers and Hebrew speakers and communists. And those who said they had no point in life itself, but they could see no future. And as a youth wrote, I see no point in living. And then 1938-39, international affairs raced ahead, encompassing the world prior to the deluge. Firstly, on October the 28th, 1938, in Szczebin, there the Germans sent Polish non-citizens of Germany across the border into a no man's land and left them there. The Poles didn't want the Jews, and the Germans certainly were not going to take the Jews. In 1939, April, Poland, or Germany, renounced the Polish-German Pact, which was as good as an announcement of war. The following month, the British announced the latest white paper restricting any entry, except for very few, to Palestine. And there were those who managed to get out of Poland around between 1921 and 1937. Some 395,000 Jews got out of Poland. But if you measure that and divide it by the 16 years, it isn't very many. On August the 31st, 1939, in Gleiwitz, there the Germans enacted a fake attack on German soldiers and German territory. Dressing up as Polish soldiers, they attacked their own people. And then on September the 1st, the following day, as a result of this attack on Poland, the Second World War commenced. Jews said, "We'll be okay. Every Pole has his Jew. Every Pole likes at least one Jew. And if there are 3 million of us and there are many more of them, we'll be okay." They prayed that Britain and France would come to their aid. They would attack Germany and come to the aid of Poland, and there would be peace as a result, and the Jews would be okay. Jabotinsky, who inspired the films, was an avid visitor to Poland. And I will read to you from a speech he made on Tisha B'Av 1938, one of the most powerful, meaningful speeches, a man of such incredible foresight, speaking to a Polish group in Warsaw. Said Jabotinsky, "It is already 3 years that I am calling upon you. Polish Jewry, you are the crown of world Jewry. I continue to warn you incessantly that a catastrophe is coming closer. I've become grey and old," and he did, "in these days, and my heart fails," and it did. "That you dear brothers and sisters do not see the volcano, which will soon begin to spill its all-consuming lava. Today, I understand. I see that you are not seeing these worries because you are consumed in your daily activities. But I demand from you that you trust me. If you do not believe me, if you do not trust me, then throw me out as you should. But you have convinced already. I know that my prognoses have already proved to be right. However, if you do believe me and do not throw me out, then listen to me in this, the 12th hour, in the name of God. Let any one of you save himself as long as there is still time. And time there is very little." Peace did come for the Jews of Poland, but in reality, it was the peace of the graveyard. Thank you.